So last summer we went to Crete. This isn't Crete, as you can probably see, but you would have heard me laughing almost hysterically on the plane going over to Crete, reading a book that was all about humans and how we've screwed it all up, specifically how we've screwed up the environment. And it was talking about a man called Thomas Midgley, and some of you may have heard of him. Bill Bryson, the travel writer, described him. He said he had this inherent capability for the regrettable, that bordered on the uncanny. And he's one of these individuals that is more responsible for the deterioration of the ozone layer than any other single human organism. And the reason being is because he put the lead in petrol, and he then went on to invent CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. Now, he actually died because one of his own inventions killed him. And he had polio, and it was a device that helped him get out of bed, and it strangled him. Now, you could say that's some sort of karmic payback, but this was a chemical engineer. He thought he was doing good. He was entrepreneurial. So it was very, very interesting when I was sat in a room a couple of months later, and I was speaking to an entrepreneur who is working with businesses to try and help them to tackle global warming. And she said something very interesting. She said, my great-great-grandfather was the most dangerous man to ever have been born. And I put two and two together because guess what? They had the same surname. And I said, oh my goodness, what a story. This is incredible. This is the karmic payback. So we ended up working together on a project with a company in Germany that has the largest plastic recycling plant in Europe. And makes the materials for stormwater tanks and wastewater and rainwater tanks, and is tackling climate change by putting these into areas where there is a rising water table caused by overbuilding in built-up areas where there's a high water table, and also to tackle global warming. So what does this have to do with thinking? What does this have to do? I mean, this is entrepreneurial, and it was great that I'm now able to work with the entrepreneur that wants that karmic payback. Well, I've also worked with veterinary professionals and with entrepreneurs who suffer from mental health issues. I had my own mental health issues many years ago, and in the veterinary profession, there is 4 times the rate of suicide than in any other profession. And I've actually got a friend of mine here, Mark Wesley. We've actually launched a project in Northampton called the Man Alive Project, because we're working with men. There's a very high suicide rate amongst young men, 3 times the suicide rate amongst men than women, again with mental health issues. But for men, they struggle to really share that. They really struggle to share that. So we're actually working with men. We're going to take them out into nature. We're going to get them to bond again. We're going to get them to share about their issues. And we're going to get them to go out into nature. And if you see the rates here, you'll see that our ability to tackle physical ailments has really changed, especially in the last century. I mean, rates of polio, for instance, have almost gone to zero, whereas mental health issues are on the increase. So there doesn't seem to be this parity of esteem that the government likes to talk about. There doesn't seem to be this balance between the physical health and the mental health. Well, tonight I want to propose a slightly different way of looking at this, which is optimistic for the future and involves entrepreneurship, but it also involves how thought works. So from a very early age, we have innate capabilities. We come out of the womb, we are able to swim straight out of the womb, and we also know where to suckle for milk. And we have learned responses to exterior stimuli, such as learning not to touch a hot surface again once we've touched it once, or even learning that spiders potentially are scary once our parents say don't touch it. Okay? These are our learned capabilities, but essentially we come out of the womb with everything we need built in a standard. We have this innate capability to deal with nature because we are part of nature. Kelly McGonigal, in her 2013 TED Talk, talked about how we respond to stress changes our physiology. So if we think of stress as a good thing, it actually means that we do better under stress. Now, this is really what I would like to talk about, because how we think about life determines our experience in life. How we think about life determines our experience in life. And whether it's entrepreneurial or dealing with people with mental health issues, there is one common denominator, and that is thought. From the moment we're born until the moment we die, we will have thoughts running through our heads. And the way that we actually interpret those thoughts will determine our experience in life. In other words, it's the meaning that we give to those thoughts. So what are thoughts? Well, in the brain, there are hundreds of billions of neurons, and they fire and wire together, and they give us neural activity. That neural activity will give us an experience. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But first of all, let's look at the hardware, because it's easy to think that the brain is where all of this takes place. Well, that would be the case, but there are examples like this 44-year-old Frenchman who lived a very normal life. He had a wife and children, and he had a job, and he was suffering from a weak leg. So he went to the doctors and he got a CT scan, and they found out that 90% of his brain wasn't there. He had water on the brain. Okay? Now, there's also a condition called congenital analgesia, or congenital insensitivity to pain, where sufferers have a malfunction in the SCN9A gene, and it means that they can't have the thought telling them that they have pain, so they can put their hand in a pot of boiling water and not know about it. So it's not a hardware issue. Well, what about a software issue? Now, many of you here will have heard of something called epigenetics. It used to be thought that our genes, our DNA, was the blueprint to our lives, and whatever DNA, whatever genes we had, that was it. That was our lot. And then recent studies have shown that that's not true. The cellular responses to the environment actually upregulate or downregulate genes. In other words, our thoughts about the environment release proteins, release neurotransmitters and hormones, which can upregulate and downregulate genes. Okay, so it's more of a software issue, but it comes back again to it's about the thought process. So for instance, if you have a Petri dish and you put healthy cells into the Petri dish and you put toxins in, those cells will suffer from the toxins. In the same way that if you put us, a community of cells, into Chernobyl in 1985, we will suffer, we will get poisoned as well. Okay? There is also something called the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is very interesting. It works better on drugs for depression than it does on physical placebos. However, there is also differences in the effectiveness and placebos in different areas of the world. For instance, placebos for gastric ulcers are less effective in Brazil than they are in Germany. So placebos tell us a little bit more about the thought, and again, it's how we think about the sugar pills that actually makes a difference. And you saw in the talk by Tali before this, that's exactly what she was talking about. How we think about something determines our experience in it. So now we have to go to, where do these thoughts take us? What is it that, from an early age, what is that actually creating in us, in the environment within us? And now we're talking about something called beliefs. So if I asked you tonight if you believed you would be able to get back out again after the show finishes, you would probably say yes, because you came in a certain way, and you would probably be able to picture in your mind and think, well, I'll probably be able to get out that way too. And that's how we live our lives. We think of a future and we imagine if it's possible. And because our body doesn't know the difference between the imagined future and the real one, we can actually change our physiology by doing that. If we actually believe it's true, we can change our physiology. And this comes back to what happens when we're small children. Because in the early ages, between the ages of 0 and 8, our brains operate in a much lower frequency, in the alpha and theta frequencies, which is why we are very good at learning. And that's where we pick up our beliefs. That's where we pick up our subconscious programming, or our limiting beliefs potentially. So what is it about beliefs? How can we change our beliefs to change our physiology? There's been some very interesting work being done by Dr. Gabor Mate in Canada, on addiction. So he works with heroin addicts in Canada, and these tend to be people that have had a very difficult childhood. They've usually suffered some sort of form of abuse in childhood. And what he found was that we don't actually get addicted to substances. And some of you will know this anyway, because if you've ever been to hospital and have been in an operation, you've actually had pure heroin pretty much. It's definitely more pure than what you would find on the streets. And you didn't get addicted to it. And that's because people don't get addicted to the substance, they get addicted to the feeling that it gives them. And what he found was with the people in Canada that he was working with, because they had such a troubled or traumatic childhood, usually there was abuse that happened, there was an emotional loss. And essentially they were using the addiction, they were using the substance abuse as a way to fill that loss. And that's what we all do. We change our feeling state because we don't like the state we're in, so we want to change it. So we will go and exercise, or we will go and drink, or we will gamble, or we will do things that are not necessarily good for us. And that's where this addictive behavior comes from. You see it these days with the kids on their phones. You know, if you're a parent, it's easier to talk to your child if you Snapchat them. So once again, we're looking at thought that's behind the process. What's interesting was when we suffer an emotional loss, if we get rejected by a loved one, there is the same physical reaction in the anterior cingulate cortex as if we are physically stabbed. It has the same physical reaction for us. So we use substances to try and change our state. But we're part of nature. We're born with everything we need already within us. And this is where looking at things like meditation and mindfulness and getting back to nature takes us back to potentially how the system works, because when we quiet our mind, we come up with new ideas. When we quiet our mind, we come up with new thinking. Einstein was just as likely to think of a cheese sandwich as he was E equals mc squared. But he thought of E equals mc squared. Watson and Crick were just as likely to have a dream about anything as they did the double helix structure of DNA. So when we take ourselves back to the system, which is already working perfectly, if you take a walk in nature, you are surrounded by systems that are working perfectly. It settled us down. But we're not separate from nature. We are part of nature. Which brings us back to thought. Because zebras don't get ulcers and babies don't need therapy. So what's happening to humans as we grow up? What's happening to us as we go through the education system and learn that we're told that failure is bad, when actually entrepreneurs will tell you that failure is the only way to learn? So fortunately, the advances in brain science are showing us through EEG machines, CAT scans, fMRI scans, that there is processes happening in the brain and in actually all the other areas of the body, and that there's ways to hack the system. And that's just what I want to talk about briefly as the optimistic hope for the future. Because ultimately it's all about choice. Now, you don't choose the next thought that comes into your head. You don't know what you're going to be thinking 5 seconds from now, let alone 5 minutes from now. But once that thought is in your head, it's your responsibility, and you can choose to do something with it. This is why the old adage of if you're stressed, take a deep breath and count to 10 makes a lot of sense. This is why meditation is good for you, because you're allowing the system to reset back to zero. So it's all about choices. So what can we do about choices? How can we use what we know about thought? How can we use what we're understanding about thought to create a better reality, to make a better future for our children? And I've created this little diagram which kind of takes you through pretty much what I've said, but I hope that it explains it in a way that is pictorial. So it starts with we have a thought. Now, we can have a thought about something that's true or not. We can have a thought about something, as in, I'm leaving the theatre after the show, and that is true for us within our physical body, for us. It doesn't necessarily have to have happened yet. But we, as human beings, we have this ability to imagine a future that hasn't happened yet. So that stimulus, that thought, we don't choose the next thought that comes into our heads, but once it's in, it's ours to take responsibility. But as a result of that thought, we do have a response to it. Now, this may be conscious or subconscious. This thought stimulates neurotransmitters, which will release proteins, which will upregulate or downregulate genes. So we have a physiological response to that. And depending on our mood, depending on how we feel, we may have a positive reaction to that, or we may have a negative reaction to that. But that works in a feedback loop. And this is what creates habits and behaviors. This is what creates the addictive behaviors of going back and wanting to have the same feeling state. Now, there's two ways of breaking this. The first is to have an insight. And I'll give you a quick example of an insight that changed someone dramatically in a split second. In the Westgate shopping hijack in Nairobi many years ago, there was a terrorist from Al-Shabaab who was shooting women and children and throwing grenades. There was a young boy called Elliot Pryor who was 4 years old from the UK, and his mother had just been shot in the leg. He came out from behind, he was in hiding, he came out of his hiding. He confronted one of the attackers and said, "Stop shooting, you're a very bad man." He was 4 years old. In that moment, a terrorist who had been brainwashed, feedback loop, having the same information again and again and again and again, had an insight so profound that he stopped shooting and said, "Please forgive us, we are not monsters." That's the power of an insight, a single thought which changed his experience, a single thought which changed him in that moment, and he set them free and he gave him chocolate. So that's one way. The other way is through knowledge. This is where we can hack the system. This is the hope for the future. Because not everyone is going to have an insight that's going to change their behavior. It does happen. I've seen so-called addicts have one thought and they say, "I don't want to do this anymore." But we can also do it through knowledge. We can do it through understanding how thinking works. And with modern technology, we're doing that more and more and more. And then also by feeding back into the system. So through meditating, through taking our brainwaves down into an alpha, theta, gamma, delta state, we can practice what it's like to be more in tune with nature. This is why it's very popular at the moment. This is why mindfulness is very popular at the moment. And so what I do with my clients is I help them to get into that state so that they become more productive, so that they don't do addictive behaviors, so that they change something in their life which they want to change. And it's working. And the result is that when you're working with people who are already entrepreneurial, guess what? They come up with even better ideas. If you ask people that make decisions in business where they get their best ideas, you get similar responses in the shower, walking the dog, out playing golf, usually when I'm not thinking about the problem. So it's by understanding how this process works that we're able to better hack the system and do more with it. And as a result of that, I actually think there is hope for the future. Because the more we understand how nature works, and the more we understand that our part in it is because we are also nature, and how our thinking works, that's going to define the behaviors that ultimately will change climate change, that will change greed, that will change hate, and change it back to useful things like love. Thank you.